So let's move to the practical person in the trenches who can share with us their stories of how to correct this issue that really every manager faces. And I'd like to welcome Mike Jablonski with us today. Mike is a veteran mortgage banker, has managed many different channels of business line in the mortgage world, has been with BB&T Wachovia, and has a long track record with success. So Mike, want to say hello?
Hey, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. You got to get
Mike,
a new picture, Pat. I've got to send you a new picture.
I don't know. You certainly look very distinguished. So,
Well, thank you.
Mike, why don't you share from a practical standpoint? I know that we have had many conversations regarding this whole issue of trying to install a coaching process that moves the originator, especially probably a veteran originator, into doing and changing their selling approach. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you have done and what you have seen worked?
Sure. And like you said, Pat, and again, thank you for having me on, and what you said is dead on. It's a coaching exercise. It is proactive coaching. And, what really has to happen is, among all things, the coach has to have the trust of the player involved. The coach has to have the support from executive management and those who are trying to sometimes it feels that way, but implement change in a sales team to for improvement, for greater production, and that's all about follow-up. That's all about making sure that the originator who is not performing to the levels that you need to perform have the are doing the prospecting, are following up with clients, are doing the relationship building with the referral sources that need to happen. Part of the process there is, coaching is not a one and done issue. You have to go back and continually follow up to make sure they're doing it. You build a system where the originator tells you what they're doing, how they're going about it, who they're talking to. You monitor their pipeline to find out, is this coaching that we're implementing, taking hold. And the coaching needs to be one-on-one and needs to be about, specifically the subject at hand. You can't include it with a lot of other things that are going on in the business, which of course there always is. If you separate coaching out, you show that it's important. You focus on one or two issues at a time, and the originator, can't help but understand the direction that you're going. But building the systems and follow-up processes that helps you understand the reporting, that helps you understand what's taking place in the field with that originator, so you can go back and follow up on a regular basis, I think is key.
So, Mike, how have you implemented in your past, positions this whole issue of coaching, and especially what we're talking about today is people that are not new to the business. These are veterans, and what worked in the past isn't working. I know what I see from a consulting standpoint, that the hub of the problem is that they might have had 20 referral sources, but today they have 10, and they have stopped doing prospecting, and ultimately they're going to have 3 if they keep not doing prospecting. So how would you address that from a senior management position when you're dealing with somebody that certainly was successful at one time?
Well, a great question. It's all about awareness. You're right. At the beginning of the process, they've got to know, they've got to understand. They've got to know what's expected. I've used minimum standards in the past for performance. I've used, that can translate to minimum standards for applications, but you can also establish minimum standards for prospecting. That can translate if you're so inclined as an organization to start tracking, these specific prospecting, activities of an originator. If, they are originating, if they are prospecting, who are they talking to? In the past, we've been able to develop some very simple reporting where an originator will actually spend a few minutes a week, with some goals in mind, i.e., we need either 10 applications or some combination of applications in the system from clients or prospecting activities from that originator. That equals 10 a week. That's a goal that you can set. Others may have different ideas about how that works, but ultimately it's about prospecting and applications. So In the past, I've measured those too. And what happens is, you monitor the applications, but then you go back and you monitor what activities they're telling you they're doing. And then you go back in a coaching exercise and even in a conference call setting with a bunch of other originators on the phone, and you talk specifically about those prospecting activities. You engage the originator, personally, one-on-one and in a group setting to openly talk about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and you refer back to those specific items that they're talking to you about, whether they met with the builder, whether they met with a realtor, whether they met with, a financial planner, or somebody, if it's internally, and you have referral sources internally with the institution, what they're doing there as well. But then that translates to, all right, so how do we know that the coach is following up? And so you do the same thing. You set goals for coaching activities for the coach. How many times did you talk to the originator about their prospecting activities? How many times did you talk to the originator about, well, things like CRA are really important, but, how many times did you talk to an originator about how well they're cross-selling if that's a part of your model? And then you develop the same goals for coaches. You need to do this X number of times a week, and we're looking forward to, not only sales calls with the originator and one-on-one coaching sessions, but sales meetings where you talk about prospecting activities. And then you go through the same simple system. You just simply tell us what you're doing, and then as a senior sales leader, you follow up with the coach. You talk about coaching sessions you have with the originators, and you engage them and talk about successes and things that didn't quite work out so well, which are okay. You need to put those out there as well. So you develop very simple reporting systems, nothing really elaborate, but in the end, it tells you what's going on. The question you need to ask is, how do we know what our originators are doing in the field from week to week, day to day? Well, we see the application. Yeah, but what about before that? Which is really where the rubber meets the road. And then how do you know your coaches are actually coaching? What are they saying? How are they coaching? Have you developed a model that you want them to follow? And you need to implement that in the process as well.
So, Mike, could you talk a little bit about, for those on the webinar today, let's assume you don't have any coaching process established, and let's assume that, this is all a new effort. I think coaching is the classic word. It's somewhat similar to mentoring. Mm-hmm. Everybody uses it, but let's say in reality they don't do it. So what would you share works with institutions that really haven't put this in place, and how often, nitty-gritty kind of answers, how often would you be requiring the coach to sit down and kind of walk through the process, if you would?
Sure. Well, the first thing you do is establish reporting that tells you what's going on in the field. You've got to know who's doing what, not only what are the originators doing. You have to understand that data is your friend here. You've got to have pretty hard raw facts, as you established, Pat, in your presentation. And then you have to decide, okay, as an institution, here is where we desire our minimum levels of performance need to be. And then you make that widely available to everybody. Beginning X, we're going to have a set of minimum standards of X number of loans or X dollars of loans of applications or closed loans, or how you want to look at that to decide, where your coaching points are going to be, whether it be cross-sell or anything else. And then you look at your coaches and you let them know, all right, weekly, I need 5 coaching activities from you. But there's an exception there, and you have to. That's where who you coach comes into play. If you have a low performer who's not meeting those standards, then you look from that coach for some sort of very simple coaching plan, whether it be a performance improvement process or anything else. And then at that point, that originator needs to be coached at least once a month, if not more often. One of the questions was asked, so when do you fire the person? We only fire them after you give them every opportunity and every effort from the coach to make them better. If you're going to sit there and say your performance isn't there and you haven't coached them, you have to ask yourself, is that fair? So establish a minimum standard for coaching for that particular originator, if they are substandard, if they're not performing, and say, all right, I'm making an investment in you, and if by the end of 90 days, 120 days, whatever you decide, I can't get you to this level, and we've coached you, then we've given every opportunity, we've invested all we can. Only then do you start thinking about, when does that person need to be, move on to another job or something else. So nitty-gritty, we look for anywhere, depending on the level of manager, we look for, anywhere between 8 and 10 coaching sessions, depending on how many direct reports you have, per week. It's all about coaching. We look for, originators that need to be mostly out there most of their time, greater than 50%, and hopefully, 16, 17, 80% prospecting, and we look for that as well. If you want to, get into the nitty-gritty about, different cross-sells, you have to have minimum standards for cross-sell. And one thing here, Pat, that really works is all this translates, in a perfect world, where you establish it, very, very clearly to anybody who's entering the company and for the folks who are already there, what the standards are, what you're looking for, where we draw the line, what we consider good performance. That needs to translate into an incentive plan. That needs to translate into, it needs to match well with how they're paid. And in a perfect world, in a beautiful world where all that matches up, you can't help but, an originator can't help but know what's expected of them from the front end. So the conversation about I didn't know becomes less and less important because they know.
So, Mike, let's talk about, especially in mortgage banking, and we're in a somewhat of a mini refi boom now. When you talk about the coaching side of it, it ends up getting put on the back burner. So what is your experience, and what would you suggest to the people on the webinar today that, brings this effort back into the front burner and recognizing that it's kind of a ticket for continued sustainable success? How do you face this issue of hey, I'm doing my loans and that's it, this whole other issue of now we're asking managers to actually perform coaching, which they may not have done for 10, 15 years because it really wasn't required of them?
That's a good question, and it's not only refis, it's, regulation, it's compliance, it's operational, right. It's administrative. There are so many, the consolidated disclosures rule that's coming up in August, everybody, there's a ton of folks I've talked to are distracted by that as well. How's that going to affect the client experience? How's that going to affect what the originator does in the field? How's that going to affect the process after we get a loan in the system and it goes to our back room? All of those things on top of what's going on in the refinance, the many refis that are going on today, are really piling on. And really it takes somebody who has to be just focused on the sales. All of that other stuff is got to happen. It's got to happen. Mostly you want to try to see how much you can take off the originator and the coach so they can coach. But in the end, how do you get back started? I call it the clear the decks letter. I look at a lot of, legal documents and while something has happened in the past, and you need to somehow stop it. You say, all right, from this point forward, here's how we're going to do things. You need to kind of establish that. Of course, you have to have the buy-in and the support from your executive leaders on down. Everybody has to have buy-in to it. That, all right, from this point forward, we have expectations around coaching. But first, you have to get a model. You have to understand how you want them to coach. You have to understand, all right, what is the message we want to send today about, what do we want to coach? How do we want to help everybody understand that we are this coaching organization? Maybe we haven't been so in the past, and that's understandable. But going forward, what is the message we want to craft that says we are a coaching organization? Here's what we're going to coach. Here's how often we're going to coach it. And then the originators need to be told, guys, here's the expectation for your coach. If they're not doing this for you, let me know. The originators should have an expectation that their coach is going to talk to them once a week or once every 2 weeks or however you decide is important. And then they are looking for it. They, like Pat said, if they're going to be folks who want to be left alone, I get that. Sometimes you can help them understand and get through the fear and realize that everybody needs to be coached, and sometimes you can't. But in the end, if they're looking for it and they're excited by it and they want to do it, then they're going to drive it from the bottom up as well as executive management and you as senior leaders are driving it from the top down.
So what happens, Mike, when the first line manager, either the branch manager or the regional manager, doesn't buy into this? In other words, they become your coaching activity because they haven't done it. And from a practical standpoint, how do you monitor how many sales calls? In other words, are you getting down to that level of issues, or talk a little bit about that?
Sure. If they haven't done it and they don't want to do it, it's probably because, and your research has shown that, they don't know how. People will drive to what they know how to do, and a lot of the times that's getting into the nitty-gritty of every loan, getting into loan issues, getting into administrative and operational issues, and they will migrate away from something that they don't know how to do very well, and that's okay. We can show you. And part of that process is developing them into a coach. The training and the practice that needs to take place to develop coaches over time is an intense effort. So you have to dispel the myth that coaching is not necessary first, and then you have to help them understand that we can teach you. There's all kinds of when you peruse the internet, there's all kinds of help out there. Classes, tutorials, methods, methodologies, models that you can pick from and decide how you want to adopt it. But in the end, you have to say, all right, we're going to teach you how to coach, and here's that process. And it's not demeaning. It's because I'm going through it as a senior leader. I'm going to do it as well to make sure I know. And then when you're coaching, what do you coach? Yes, you absolutely coach. How many sales calls did that originator have this week? And you help the manager who's directly involved with the originators, who directly supervise originators, have that conversation. You practice that conversation with that manager in role play and in practice sessions, helping them understand how that coaching process should take place. So when you have we have data. We used to call it a coaching card in some of the institutions I used to work for. You have a card for each originator that pops up every month, and sometimes you have weekly reports that show you what they're doing on a weekly basis. And you sit down with them and you talk to them about those specific items, especially the prospecting and what they're doing and how they're doing it. If it comes to the quality of the applications in their pipeline and the fact that stuff isn't pulling through like you want it to, you have that conversation. You go over what might be happening and why. You set goals for the next conversation. You say, all right, by then we're going to have to done this, and by the way, I want to go on 2 calls with you next week. Those are the kinds of originator conversations that a coach who directly manages originators should be having. And then on the other side of that, then the senior leader is looking at that coach's activity and saying, all right, notice you coached Jason on his quality of applications or his quality of his pipeline. Tell me what happened. And you do that on a one-on-one setting. You also do that in a conference setting with other coaches. So we're all learning. We're all understanding what's happening out there. They're all seeing that everybody's going through this process. So changing ourselves from administrators and operational guys into coaches and getting out of the day-to-day loan and mid-loan activity, which has to happen. I'm not saying that doesn't. It's Shangri-La to think that nobody needs to get into a low-level basis to figure out what's going wrong and how to fix it. But in the end, you want that to be less of your activity and the other side of it to be more coaching.
So from your practical experience, really, a coaching model that you're talking about kind of preempts having producing managers that are doing their own production. Would that be correct?
Well, there's a mixed bag out there, and Pat, I've talked to a lot of folks, over the past several months about, different positions and how they work. And while, I have not been a big fan of producing branch managers in the past, I'm always willing to learn and understand how that position works at different institutions. But I'll say this, it's very difficult to split your loyalties between your own production and being a good coach to those who are working for you. I know that's hard. For those producing branch managers who are able to do it, have done a great job of it, congratulations. You are a rare breed, and I want to know, I'd love to know how it's done. I'm not, against any one model or another, but I just know that is one of the most difficult things that you can put on a producing manager's lap is, yes, I need your production, but hey, your folks deserve to be coached, and your folks deserve to have an investment in your time for personal and professional growth. And, if you're not investing that time in the personal and professional growth of your team, it's got to be rebalanced somehow.
So when you look at it from a quantitative standpoint, what do you see as the most effective length of time, if you had to put a number to per originator, how much coaching should be occurring on a weekly basis from an hours standpoint?
Mm-hmm. Whether it be over the phone or in person, and again, it all goes down to, Pat, what kind of span of control does the manager have? Obviously a manager who has a span of control of 20 mortgage loan officers is going to be hard-pressed to have frequent conversations. A manager who has a span of control of anywhere around 8 or 10 is going to have a better time at being able to have good, solid conversations where the originator is, where the company and the manager and the coach is making an investment in the personal and professional growth of that originator. But I think, a manager, a sales leader, whether it be in a coaching exercise over the phone or in person, needs to touch each one of their originators a week at some level. A personal coaching session needs to last where you're sitting down with that originator. You need to have at least one of those a month. And you need to have something in front of you that the originator already sees, has already seen, already knows about, have already seen the results. So what you're talking about is not a surprise, so you can get through that and talk about the issue at hand. That probably needs to be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. But at the end of that, you need to have goals for the next conversation. Where you're saying, all right, here's where you were. Let's talk about next month, and let's talk about the month after that. Talking about some of the things we discussed. You said you were going to do X, Y, and Z, and you outline what it is that was agreed upon. And then you follow up. You look at the reports in your next conversation. I know I've had a lot of conversations with coaches over time where, it's like the previous conversation from last month never occurred, because we're on to something else. You got to connect the dots. You got to go from one month to the next. You got to wrap up what was and then start on what is, and then connect yourself to the next conversation before you leave. All of that's got to flow. And, I would say in person, you've got to have, an in-person conversation once a month is ideal, but over-the-phone conversations, at least weekly with your originator, are ideal.
Mm-hmm. So as a head of salesperson, and you are really, you're monitoring the numbers that they are providing you of coaching activities and, let's say, prospecting activities. Is that correct? And then are you going down to the loan officer level, or are you just going down to the coach versus your way of kind of making sure that things are occurring?
Sure. Well, it becomes pretty obvious over time if you have good reporting, good factual-based reporting,
right,
as to who's coaching and who isn't. You can pretty much figure out that where a pipeline is pretty thin over here, but in a similar market, they're going gangbusters. And you know that this guy, particular coach, is investing, in the weaker market, a lot less time and is caught up on deals and caught up on operations. And you can tell by their coaching activities that they've turned in. So it becomes pretty obvious. You don't really have to go down to the originator level to realize
right,
something is amiss when you have a coaching activity log that isn't there. So you start with the coach. You start with the coach and you talk to the coach and you help them understand the importance of it. You may some retraining or recoaching of that coach, and then you're involved in how they're integrating with their team, how they're coaching their team. You make sure you reset the expectations. Once in a while, you will have to get involved with an employee that is at risk. That's what we used to call it a 90-day performance plan, where we say we've done all we can. We're going to make this person our project for 90 days. In that case, then, as a senior leader, I would get involved, and we would talk about those things. Sometimes they would, a manager would not want to put them on a performance plan, and in which case then we talk about that too. Tell me why. Are there reasons why? More often than not, it was only for the person not being a good performer because they were out on sick or medical leave or something of that nature. Outside of that, it was pretty thin as to why we wouldn't put them on a plan. So, at those occasions where somebody is at risk and you want to make sure that that coach is following up with that originator on a monthly basis at least, in person on a weekly basis more so, to make sure we're making the investment in that originator as much as we can to save them. If we can't, we can't. If they're not meeting the expectations we set for them in the plan, then, it's a mutually agreed upon parting of ways that is not a surprise to anybody.
Right, right. So, Mike, I wanted to ask you before we open it up for questions from the audience. I find it interesting and always admired the rule of 10 strategy. So maybe if you could talk today about what's the rule of 10 and how you used it in your past positions.
Sure, and the rule of 10 was developed, when I was at BB&T. It was not even my idea. It came up from one of my sales leaders who did a great job of deciding, today we're going to make sure, and for the near future, that our folks are at least doing 10 of either a combination of prospecting activities or loan applications. And they decided that if you give me 10 applications a week, I'm not going to talk to you too much about your prospecting activities. But if you're giving me 2, I'm looking for 8 prospecting activities, and we're going to talk about them. And the originator would list what those prospecting activities are. And prospecting activities are realtor, builder, financial planner calls, or social events where they go to the board of realtors and they've actually integrated with and talked to new possible contacts. Internal sales discussions with other lines of business who could be referring to you if that's the model of the organization. And it's real easy to have an originator decide what prospecting activity is that's not really. Talking to an individual borrower about a loan or a potential loan, taking a pre-qual, being added, being handed a referral from somebody. That's not a prospecting activity. That's the product of a prospecting activity. Client rate discussions or client discussions that didn't turn into applications. Originators will have the idea that, hey, that's prospecting right there. Now you need real, genuine prospecting activities for those to be counted in the rule of 10, i.e. 10 applications a week or a combination of 10 applications of prospecting activities. And they went into a very simple system that was online. They had a web page for themselves, and it was a very simple form, and it took a couple of minutes to fill out, and they told us what was being done. And then the coach can actually look to take a look at their pipeline, match the pipeline with the prospecting activities, and then they'll know exactly where to coach. Is the quality not there? Who are they talking to? They will have, again, individual conversations with that originator about the prospecting activities that they report, but also group setting to make sure that everybody can hear best practices and some things we learn by our mistakes. But it's go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's a great organized way to really monitor what's going on at the field. And I've seen this done at other companies where they use a point system. But what I like about the rule of 10 is it's pretty simplistic. X applications get you, and then X sales activity, so it's a known equation. At other companies, what I've seen is somewhat of a more complex strategy where you accrue points for doing various different things, but I think mathematically that ends up being a little bit more confusing. So I thought it was a great simplistic approach that anybody on the call could really put in place today. Mike, did you see that having a big impact when you installed that approach?
It did, but again, it's one of those things, Pat, that as a coach, it takes time.
Yes.
When you implement the process, you just want them to start using it. At the beginning of the process, we didn't care as sales leaders in my organization what they put into it, as long as they started doing it.
Right.
And then over time, we started looking for participation rates being at X, and we started talking to the folks who weren't participating. And then when we got participation, then we went back and we said, all right, now we're going to start refining what you're doing that's being keyed in. And over time, we started, again, a lot of change all at once where we're looking for everything to be perfect from day one. It's not going to happen. So you migrate to it over time. You let them play with it, and then they start using it as a tool. The only thing I regret, is that it wasn't a system that actually gave useful information back to the originator to show like a true CRM, how many calls they made on this realtor, how many calls they made on this builder over the past week, and how many loans they got from that realtor or builder. That's a true CRM, and if you can incorporate this system into a CRM, it can be 10 times more valuable, to the coach and to the originator. And now they've got, outside of getting benefit from the coaching from their coach, they've actually got useful information they can go back to and say, hey, I owe a call to this realtor. I haven't seen him in 10 days. And that's ideal.
Yeah, that's a great point, but I would like to emphasize the previous point that Mike was making is that you don't have to wait for Salesforce.10 for you to jump into actually installing something like this. You can do it on a much more simplistic level, and really, from a practical standpoint, how much more simple can it be that you have to have an application component and then you have to have a prospecting component. If companies installed that, trust me, they would have a lot better results,
Yeah.
especially when you're
For us,
talking.
it was
Mm-hmm.
yeah. For us, it was a very simple intranet web page that a technology developer did as a side project for us. That built a form on a web form on a web page and gave one to, as each originator was onboarded to the organization, they were automatically, assigned, their page. And then he built a very simple roll-up of all the data where, it wasn't anything magical. It was just pretty much a long list of the activities, who did them, what the activity was, when it was done, and who they do it to. And it was just very, very basic, but very useful.
Right. All right, so let's open it up for some questions from the audience today that you might have for Mike so he can answer them. So go to the chat feature and feel free to write your questions. Mike, there's one question that we have already about how did you select the coaches, the individuals that you're talking about?
That's a great point, and that's key. First of all, if you want to start coaching or start intensifying your coaching efforts, you got the coaches you got, whether they may be good coaching material or not, based on your opinions or your assessment. You got to give them a chance. Every coach that's out, every sales leader that's out there, every mortgage manager that's out there that touches an originator, you've got to give them a chance to show them how. You got to show them how to coach. You got to show them how you want it done. You got to show them the model you're using. You got to practice it, and only then do you start deciding. Maybe this. I'll tell you that in some cases you'll have some coaches who self-select and decide, you know what, it's time for me to go. But other coaches will say, finally, somebody's teaching. Somebody's helping me understand how to make an impact and adding value to the lives of my originators. After that, you've got to go back and you have to fill in spaces with true coaches, and that's the interview process. Pat, I know you've got some great tools to help you understand, the hiring of managers. Use the tools that are out there, folks, and assess. Does this individual have a coaching a coaching mentality? Actually sit down in the interview process and have them coach you. As a sales leader, if you're going to hire somebody, have them coach you. Show me how you coach. Tell me how that works. They may be diamond in the rough, but man, if you got one, you can train them on how to do it your way. Make sure they talk to other individuals besides you. As a sales leader, you want to make sure that the folks who are touching your originators from a coaching perspective are talking to your operations folks, or talking to other sales leaders or other leaders within the mortgage organization, just to get different opinions. Don't make assumptions, but that's how I go about it.
Yeah, one thing that we would share, and Mike mentioned, we have done a lot of research on this arena about the manager level, and coaching and developing is a competency that top managers within mortgage banking have. Likewise, what that also means is that not everybody is, has that internal personality characteristics to coach, and that's really where if that is the case and it's identified, the coach needs to get coached before he can coach or she could coach other people. So I agree 100% with Mike that you owe it to that leader to, it's easy when the person does have the competencies. It's better if you can catch that during the interview process. And then likewise, if they don't have that competency, then you're talking about they need to be coached first before they can actually coach other people. Another question that we have from the audience, has to do with, I guess, the performance plan part of it, where if the coaching is continuous, then what triggers them from, I guess, essentially poor performance is what ends up being where that puts them on a performance plan? Or let's say
Sure.
how does that work?
That's a great question, and you as a sales leader, you have to decide what constitutes minimum level standards of performance for me, for my organization, for an originator. Let's focus on the originator. How many loans closed per month, or how many applications, or whatever you think is fair. And I've done it in the past on a 6-month rolling average, so you can kind of account for the ups and downs of the mortgage industry. Some of you guys may think that's too long. Some of you may think it's too short. But whatever you think is fair for your organization, you have to decide, what works. And again, I think the rolling averages for a number of months is probably the best way to go about it. Am I not getting the dollars? Am I not getting the units? Am I not getting the cross sales? Am I not getting whatever it is that you want to manage? And when they hit that minimum standard, it is by default automatic that they're put on a performance plan. Everybody, when they hit those standards. Now, the exceptions are, as I said in the past, where the person's been on medical leave or maternity leave, or there's been some outside influence that kept them from doing that. But in the end, your HR department's going to demand that you be consistent about the application of a performance process like this. So that's why you got to really think it through carefully before you do it, because you got to stick to it. The moment you start deviating from it and giving exceptions because you're feeling like maybe this guy should have been better, but only this happened, and you can't really document it, but you feel good about it, all of a sudden your whole process falls apart. I'm not saying there's not exceptions, but I'm just saying you need to carefully think about them.
Well, Mike,
so
we have to
have minimum standards. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we have to have you come back and talk about that, because I see that as a big issue at most companies. If they have standards, they don't implement them, or they don't have any standards. And the reality of it is you really need to. Mike, I have one last question that was asked from the audience. In your career of looking back when you have installed a coaching process, have you been able to tie together any numbers to show that, yes, this coaching really worked?
Absolutely. I mean, by default, if you're spending more time with your originators, helping them learn how to get more loans,
right,
you're going to get more loans. I mean, it's not a freak of nature. It is absolutely true. It's linear. It works. Anytime you pay attention to the originators who are bringing revenue in, you're going to get in a positive way where you're trying to add value personally and professionally. You're trying to help them grow personally and professionally. Anytime you're doing that, you're putting forth a they trust you, a sincere effort. They trust you in the process, and they know that you want them to be better. They will be. And I'll say this for any part of the organization, whether it be operations, whether it be processors, or whether it be closers, whether it be underwriters to a certain extent. A lot of what they're doing is not easily, coached because guidelines are guidelines. But if you have processors, you start coaching the processors on their interactions with originators and clients, and you start coaching individuals on helping them grow personally and professionally, they want to do a better job. They'll always want to do a better job. They'll, positive people who are engaged and a good cultural match for your organization will want to do better. That is by default true. You will also understand very quickly who doesn't, and you'll know who your issues are if you implement something like this. That's a benefit as well. Perhaps you can turn them around, perhaps you can't. But yes, you do get positive numbers.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Mike, for sharing all your expertise on this important topic of really installing change in a sales organization at the loan officer level. You really had great comments. I would ask anyone in the audience to reach out to Mike on LinkedIn. I'm sure he'd be glad to LinkedIn with you, and I'm sure he'd be glad to answer any other questions that you might have from today's webinar. So thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts.